Well, I'm Dr. Michael Lewis. I'm a retired Army colonel and physician, founder of Brain Health Education and Research Institute and private practice that is called Brain Care. The thing that brought me to looking at omega-3 oils for traumatic brain injury was sort of a combination of events. I was stationed at Walter Reed Military Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, teaching at the medical school, the military's medical school there. And I just sort of saw some things that kind of put two and two together and came up with an odd number. And went to the head of research for the Defense Veteran Brain Injury Center and asked the question, is anybody looking at the use of omega-3 fatty acids to help our soldiers recover from traumatic brain injury? And the answer was, no, why don't you? And I made every excuse because, you know, it's not my field. I'm not a neurologist or a neurosurgeon or a biochemist. And he said, but you're the only one asking the question. And so that was a career changer for me. The military, since I brought up the issue of omega-3s, they've not necessarily embraced it. It's certainly not standard of care medicine. So the idea of alternative therapies for traumatic brain injury, the military's actually done some work with it through what's called the NICO, the National Intrepid Center of Excellence. There's several locations, but certainly the main one and the original one at Walter Reed National Medical Center. They've embraced things like acupuncture. They actually are starting to use fish oil on a fairly regular basis. Not as aggressive as I think they should be, but they're certainly and slowly getting to the idea of alternative therapies can be helpful. My experience putting together research for the military using omega-3s as an intervention with soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, unfortunately just kept hitting roadblock after roadblock, scientific roadblocks as well. But one of the first studies that I was able to get done was with a good friend and researcher at the NIH, a psychiatrist named Dr. Joe Hiblin. And he and I put together a study looking at suicides for active duty soldiers. And we looked at 800 documented suicides after 9/11 and 800 well-matched controls. And what we found was that number one, we have as a population, soldiers tend to have very low omega-3 levels in the blood. 25 to 1 omega-6s to omega-3s, but most importantly, that represented that difference when we looked at it. 95% of soldiers that we looked at their blood had low omega-3 levels, and it's correlated to a 62% increased risk of suicide, documented suicide. And so that was we thought it was a very profound study that we got published in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry, ended up in CNN, headline news, front page of the USA Today, and ended up me in the Pentagon briefing 4-star generals about our findings. Biggest issue, maybe one of the biggest obstacles to why this is not mainstream medicine is who's going to benefit from it. And I hate to say this, but it's about money. So who's going to benefit from fish oil? Well, obviously the patients are. But until one of the areas we need to really we need to work on more of an economic model. Like, how much does fish oil cost and what are the potential savings of outcomes? Because the model that the pharmaceutical industry works on is how much money do we spend to get a drug through FDA clearance for a particular situation? And then therefore, how do you get insurance to cover it? Because that's really what drives this. It's part pharmaceutical industry, part insurance. So how do we get the system to cover it financially when fish oil is generic? So the big pharmaceutical companies aren't going to invest the hundreds of millions of dollars the FDA requires to get anything through the system to be a drug indication when you can go to your local down the street pharmacy and buy fish oil for pennies. It's already generic, so there's not the profit potential for big pharmaceutical industries. So we really need to work a better economic model, how from a societal point of view, or even a hospital point of view, to help with omega-3s, how that would help decrease costs. The science behind omega-3 oils is that, the brain's made of fat, and about 30% of the weight of the brain is these omega-3 fats. You can't have a conversation about omega-3s without also talking about omega-6s. And so both are vitally important. You cannot build a brain in utero without omega-6s and omega-3s. They're literally the bricks, kind of thing of structure of the brain for brain, neuron cell membranes. But the downstream effects when they're metabolized have very different actions. Omega-6s tend to be very pro-inflammatory, whereas omega-3s are meant to balance that and not so much anti-inflammatory, but pro-resolving. So you need inflammation. That's just part of life, but you need to be able to resolve it, and that's what omega-3s do. Unfortunately, our American diet, we have, some people say we're deficient in omega-3s, but in reality, we're just so overabundant of omega-6s that it's made a relative deficit. So it's no longer this even paired balance between omega-6s and omega-3s. I've done studies, and we came out looking at military populations, for example, that were 25-1 out of balance. And that's really, really much more typical of your American diet, and that reflects you are what you eat. So why do we have so many omega-6s in our diet? And it's really, you could try to eat healthy and organic, but it's really ubiquitous throughout our food supply because omega-6s are shelf stable. And so when you process foods, you want to use something that's going to make them shelf stable so that they can be transported all around the world, for example. And so omega-6, you could put it out in the sun, something that's made with omega-6, you put it out in the sun for a couple of days and it's not going to spoil. But you put a piece of fish out in the sun for an hour, it's going to spoil. And so that's really, omega-3s, the good and the bad of it is they spoil very easily, but the way they're structured, they're very flexible molecules, which is actually one of the things that makes them so valuable. So we have this overabundance of omega-6s. We don't get enough omega-3s, say from seafood, from dark leafy green vegetables. Actually, animal meats can be very high in omega-3s. Grass-fed beef, for example, or lamb can be very high in omega-3s as compared to your lot-fed chicken, which is fed soybean, which is the biggest source of omega-6s in the American diet today. All right, so is there a difference between dietary omega-3s and supplement omega-3s is a great question. So absolutely 100%, if you can get enough omega-3s from the food that you eat, from your lifestyle, that would be great. There's no, hands down, all you have to do is look at the Japanese or other fish-eating cultures and what are their omega-3 levels, what are their omega-6 levels, and they're significantly better than typical American levels. But you want to advise Americans to eat even 4 or 5 servings of really good quality, high omega-3 fish, whether that's salmon, whether that's really good tuna, mercury-free tuna, other types of fish. Most people, number one, won't do it. Americans just don't eat fish like that. Japanese eat fish breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The other thing is it can be really expensive. So I turn to, one of the things is after somebody's had a head injury, I want to change that 25-to-1 ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s as quickly as possible. You could try to breed out the omega-6s, but it's fat, so it's going to take months or years. When somebody has a head injury, you want to do it as quickly as possible. So I want to change that ratio really, really quick. So I want to saturate the brain with omega-3s as quickly as possible, and you can't do that through food. You can really only do that with supplementation. So one of the concerns taking higher doses of fish oil, and let me say what's a higher dose. So the FDA tells us that 3,000 milligrams of the combined amounts of EPA and DHA, the two long-chain omega-3s, DHA, the one that gets incorporated into the brain, EPA, which we kind of know is more of the heart-healthy one, more of the cardiovascular one. The FDA tells us generally recognized as safe or GRAS level is 3,000 milligrams of EPA and DHA. So what do they mean by generally recognized as safe? There's no real known side effects at that level. With higher doses, the concern is, does it thin the blood too much? Some people will say, thin the blood, which is not really accurate. It just means that platelets don't clot as easily, which is all the reason why it's heart healthy. So you think about taking a baby aspirin a day, a very, very common recommendation. It's to keep the blood from clotting too easily, because that's what causes a heart attack. Well, fish oil does the same sort of thing, but it does it from a much more natural way. Instead of blocking the process of platelet clotting, it basically potentiates the non-stickiness of platelets so that clots don't form, and that's why it's really heart healthy. You take really, really high doses, people are going to bruise easier. They're going to be more susceptible, but it's really not much more. It's a very big misconception. It's really not any more than if you were taking a baby aspirin a day. One of the questions that always comes up in lectures or when I'm dealing with patients is if they're on blood thinners, such as Coumadin, warfarin, heparin, whatever's out there these days. And doctors are always, no, you can't take fish oil, you're on a blood thinner. Well, your blood can't clot when you're on those, so how could you make that situation worse? But let me tell you, warfarin's a rat poison. It's not going to help your brain, but fish oil will do a similar thing and be beneficial for your brain. So one of the questions that always comes up is what form of fish oil or what form of omega-3 should you take? Because everybody wants to talk about bioavailability, for example. So is krill oil better than fish oil? It's really about the form of the omega-3s. So if you squeeze a fish, you get triglycerides, principally some phospholipids. Krill oil has a little bit more phospholipids than triglyceride, but both good fish oil, triglyceride form fish oil, and phospholipids are very, very well absorbed. What is always comes up as an issue is if that fish oil is not well absorbed, it's because it's not in one of those two forms, and that's part of the manufacturing process. So we want to go through this molecular distillation because you want to clean the fish oil and make sure that you're giving omega-3s, not mercury and PCBs and heavy metals and toxins. So you want to obviously clean it, separate that out. That process actually tears apart the omega-3 molecule and combines it with an alcohol molecule, and the result of that is called an ethyl ester. And so the quickest thing, concentrate it, put it into a pill, and sell it, and it costs virtually nothing to be able to do that. It's much more difficult to reverse engineer it and put it back into a triglyceride form. And so subsequently, manufacturers want to save money. They put it out in the ethyl ester form, which is no longer actually an oil. our bodies, our guts don't know how to digest ethyl esters. We've never been exposed to them throughout mankind. It's a really, in the last 20 year kind of phenomenon. And so we don't have the enzymes, we don't have the ability to digest these ethyl esters. So it's really all about the form. How does the omega-3 molecule get to the gut? And if it's in triglyceride form, it's going to be very well absorbed. So one of the big questions always comes up is, how do you know the difference? When you pick up a bottle of fish oil and you're at Whole Foods or whatever store, how can you just tell by the label? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Most good quality fish oils will actually tell you on the label that it is ethyl ester form or that it's triglyceride form. And so that's the easiest way. If it doesn't say what type of form it is, I can guarantee you it's in an ethyl ester form. The other, really maybe not such a quick way to determine that, you could of course contact the company and ask, but the other thing, this is a great way to test it. Take your fish oil capsule and chew it. And if it tastes like it should, without a whole lot of fishy flavor and whatever, it's triglyceride form. If it's caustic, tastes horrible, tastes really bad, fishy type of form, it's an ethyl ester. So I've been working with patients about 12 years now, and I've gotten quite a bit of experience. And you know, fish oil supplementation, number one, the first thing, if it doesn't seem to be working in somebody, it's one of typically two issues. Number one would be compliance. They're just not taking the amount of fish oil that I think that they should, or that I directed them to. The second one is, which I think is I'm becoming more and more aware of, more appreciative of, is one thing is, people have a head injury, it tends to also affect their gut and their digestion. And actually, we now are learning, scientific studies are coming out that say if you have a head injury, it affects the gut flora. And that has everything to do with how we digest things. So the second area that can be an issue is people aren't digesting it well enough. So overall, I would say 70–80% of people have a very beneficial reaction to taking especially the higher doses that I like to start people off in a higher loading dose for a little while. And if they do it the way I talk about it, they tend to get a noticeable improvement in their energy levels and maybe their clarity of thought within a day or two. What other conditions might be helped with these types of doses with omega-3s? Other than just traumatic brain injury or concussion, I've had experience dealing and helping people with the recovery following a stroke, following a heart attack where they might have gone without blood flow for a couple minutes, near drownings, very similar. An anoxic injury where you're not getting blood flow to the brain for whether it's because your heart stopped or because of a near drowning. And the other one that I've found, actually several that I've found, some mental health issues. ADHD, omega-3s can help tremendously. Just somebody that has anger issues, omega-3s seem to have this calming effect. People that are struggling with their energy, it has a energetic effect, but not like coffee or caffeine. And chemo brain. People that have had an insult to their brain from chemotherapy. It's basically, that's a traumatic brain injury just induced by chemicals from the chemotherapy. And they can really struggle just like a TBI patient after chemotherapy. So all those patients and a variety of mental health type of issues, it's nutrition. It's the foundation. So some people ask me, well, how long do I need to take fish oil or omega-3s? And I'm like, how long do you plan on eating? Because this is food. This is nutrition. This is a nutritional supplement. It's meant to supplement your intake of food. It's not meant to replace it, and it's not a pill, it's not a drug, it's not a cure. It's the nutritional foundation of what our brains need, what our brains are made of, but what our brains need to function properly. As far as using omega-3s for brain injury, and all brain injuries, so I've dealt with people that have had strokes, for example, anoxic injuries. Somebody has a heart attack and doesn't get blood flow to their brain for minutes, or or through CPR, as well as traumatic brain injury of all spectrum, from severe to your typical weekend sports concussion. One of the biggest issues that I've dealt with over the last dozen years talking about omega-3s, traumatic brain injury, concussions, is getting, I'm an MD, I'm an allopathic doctor, as traditionally trained as any doctor out there, and I get a lot of skepticism, a lot of pushback from other doctors, my fellow colleagues, that it's just fish oil, that can't really help, or you're going to hurt a patient. The ones that really hurt the most is when you've got I've got a parent reaching out to me that their kid was in a car accident, and the doctors are telling them there's nothing we can do, there's nothing more we can do, you should pull the plug, or let your child die. Can you imagine telling that to a parent? And the parents, out of desperation, wanting to do anything and everything they can, have reached out to me, and there's dozens, if not hundreds, by this time. And you got nothing else to lose. Time may heal the brain, but omega-3s can help speed that process. And so I always like to point out one story, and I call it the story of Bobby. Bobby was a typical 18-year-old teenager who was doing stupid things like 18-year-old high school seniors do when the parents are out of town. He had the family car and he's running around high speeds, got a speeding ticket, and then about a half hour after that still didn't learn his lesson, bad car accident. Took him an hour and a half to extract Bobby out of the car, fly him to the nearest trauma center. The parents who were out of town get called, your son, there's been a bad car accident, there's no hope. You should just let us pull the plug. And the parents, of course, rush back home, and they prayed, they did everything that they could, and they eventually reached out to me, and a week later, Bobby still hadn't died, and they reached out to me and they said, is there anything we could do? Do you think omega-3s might help? And so I talked to the neurosurgeon, and in that case, the neurosurgeon was open to it. That's the exception, and that's what we have to change. Bobby went to his high school graduation 3 months later and has gone on to move out of the house, have an independent life now years later. But that neurosurgeon, she was absolutely the exception. So I get this pushback principally through parents that the doctors won't let me do it. It might hurt my child. I'm like, well, but they're telling you to pull the plug. So what's the harm here? And I don't know how we can overcome that. So Bart Goldstein is a really interesting situation. So Bart, as you probably know, had a very severe car accident when he was 16. And Bart didn't come into my world until maybe 12 years later, when I saw some articles by his father in the Brainline Journal. I think it was online, somebody sent it to me. So I reached out to Bart's dad, Joel, and basically said, have you tried using omega-3s? And Joel told me that that was part of his regimen. He was taking omega-3s. I'm like, yeah, but have you really tried omega-3s, like at the levels I'm talking about? And this is all done by email. And so Joel basically convinced Bart to start taking these higher doses, and the response 12 years after the accident, I think, is nothing short of miraculous. from what I understand, and I've actually never met Bart in person, I hope to someday soon, but that he only had 15% use of his right hand, right arm from after the accident, and he was right hand dominant. And after a month or two, Mom and Dad went to visit him, and they went out to a Korean restaurant, and Bart didn't say a word. He just picked up some chopsticks and started picking up little bits of rice and eating with it. And then something like the story goes that, then he went home and Bart pulls out a guitar out of the closet and starts playing the guitar. He had 12 years after the accident, something about the fish oil helped his brain, helped that process to where he gained a lot more functionality with his right arm, which he lacked before. One of the questions everybody wants to ask is, how much do I take? So I take 3,000 milligrams every single day. My wife, my kids do. I'm basically a doctor that focuses on helping people recover from traumatic brain injury and concussions, and I allowed my son to play football in high school. And he was a starting star running back, leading rusher his last 2 years of high school. And in his junior year in the spring, he switched over and started picking up rugby. So now he's off to college playing rugby, a Division I level rugby, but he doesn't leave the breakfast table without taking 3,000 milligrams every single day. I can tell you, anybody I ever interact with, they take fish oil. If they didn't before they met me, they take fish oil after they met me. But how do we translate from a personal, individual level, whether you're talking about a four-star general in the Army or the head of AMA or the head of a hospital system, how do you translate that institutionally? How do we change how medicine's practiced? That's the conundrum I'm fighting. The reason why I call it Brain Health Education and Research Institute is because it's about brain health, number one. Number two, it's about education, both education of providers and of parents and patients. So it's a little more of a grassroots approach from the bottom up. Education and research. We need to do the research to be able to get these things into the scientific literature, and that's what I would call that top-down approach. And so you need to do it from the bottom up and the top down, and hopefully we'll meet in the middle. Doctors tend to they want to see the science, they want to see the evidence it works, and that's only going to come out of the scientific literature. So we need the research as well as the education of parents and providers and patients.